Mr. Bailey? Mr.
Present.
Brown? Well, thank you. Mr. Brown?
Here.
Ms. Herbert? Dr. Bustles?
Here.
Mr. Brennan? Mr. McDowell?
Yes.
Mayor Rickaman?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend McDowell, would you like to say the invocation, please?
Oh Lord, for all that you've done for us for this day and all the possibilities you've allowed us to share in, grace and for mercy. For this city as it continue to expand and bloom and blossom in ways that are creative and positive. Bless us all. We ask it in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Mr. Mayor and council, are you ready, Mr. Mayor, to get started?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, sounds great. Well, we know that we have embarked upon a discussion about our parking rates in particular, and have a study that's been done that we are certainly excited to share the implications and the information from that study with City Council again and now with the public. But I wanted to say that this is a much bigger discussion because the growth, as we continue to say, that theme of growth with the City of Columbia dictates that we ensure that our facilities, in particular our parking decks, represent what we aspire to be, what we are and what we continue to aspire to be. And that means giving the best impressions at our facilities and the best customer experience for our citizens and customers as they do their business, as they visit our wonderful city on a daily basis. And so part of the why behind the rate study is to bring us current and to be able to support fiscally what we need to do to make sure our decks are of the very best that they can be, and the entire customer experience with parking services is at its best. So I really want to compliment our staff for having hung in there to get to this point, working with our rate consultant who's here today, Mr. Benjamin Sands, the manager for parking planning and operations with WGI, who conducted a very thorough rate study, and you will see that it encompasses comparisons from cities very similar to us, and I guess the trends, but also the amount of time that has passed that we haven't addressed this. And sometimes those hard subjects, we have to take them on and get it done. And so we wanted to make sure that we were giving enough time between the discussion publicly of the rate study and the implications, and hopefully an implementation period by the beginning of the calendar year in January. So with that, we'll get started with our City of Columbia parking rate study, a combined effort of presenting by Mr. Henry Simons, Assistant City Manager for Operations, Ms. Elle Matney, Director of Parking Services, and again, Mr. Benjamin Sands, our consultant. And so with that, we'll get started. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mayor, Council, City Manager Wilson. We appreciate having an opportunity to provide an update on the parking operation and facilities. As Ms. Wilson indicated, we will also provide an update on the parking rate study that will be presented by Mr. Sands with WGI. And let me just say a word of thanks to parking operations as well as parking facilities. Now, oftentimes, these areas don't receive the recognition and the acknowledgement because of the nature of their work behind the scenes. But I want to say publicly that we value their efforts and we appreciate the work that they do for our city. Elle and Tori and Kelvin and Stacey and the entire team, I want to thank them for their commitment to doing this work every single day. We know we've had some hot days, especially on the enforcement side, and oftentimes they're out in over 100-degree weather providing services for our city. So operationally, they do great work. So we're actually grateful for the work that they're doing. I want to invite Elle Matney, who's going to get us started on the operations side, to present to you today. That'll be followed by some of our facilities team. All right, Elle.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, Mayor, City Council, City Manager. Thank you for this great opportunity to share great, exciting things up and coming for the Parking Services Division. So before we jump into the rate study, we wanted to give everyone an update of operations and our facilities. So let's jump in. We're quickly going to run through an agenda of talking about the parking system overview, some of our economic development partnerships, project highlights, and our capital improvement plan. Parking Services, the division is divided into two departments, some of you may or may not know. We have the Operational Division and the Parking Facilities Division. Parking Facilities consist of Director Calvin Kiesler. That includes facility maintenance, facility cleaning, and they have 11 staff members. Parking Operations, that includes enforcement, meter shop, the front office, events, a parking business liaison, and we currently have 45 staff members. To give you an overview of what these two divisions maintain and operate, 11 parking decks, 14 surface lots, over 3,600 on-street meters, over 1,400 passport parking spaces on street, 47 in and out monthly parking blocks, 6 residentially permitted parking areas. We have over 3,400 monthly parkers with 11,000 parking spaces. We accommodate 9 hotels here within Columbia. We accommodate over 500 city staff members. The average number of monthly events that we accommodate would be 29. The average number of monthly citations that we issue, 8,700. And the number of bagged meters that we process monthly on a basis would be over 500. As we dig deeper into parking services operations, let me take a moment and introduce Tori Salvant, and she'll tell you about some of the great things happening in the parking division.
Good afternoon, Council, City Manager. I'm here to introduce a few things that Parking Services has been doing for the last couple of years. Let me first start with Park Hub. Park Hub is a mobilization, is an event modular that we are currently using. We went from people giving cash for events to now they can swipe their card, they can tap, they can use Park Hub. We have been using Park Hub ever since 2023. At this current time, the University of South Carolina and the Fireflies are currently using Park Hub. If you're looking to see, since January of this year, we have done a total of 55 events with over $234,000 on-site revenue, with parking over 19,000 vehicles. Some of our top events with Park Hub would be Cat Williams back in February when we had over $11,000 on-site revenue, Lauren Dingle with $9,000 revenue, and we've parked a total of over 11,000 vehicles. Also with Parker McCullum event on March the 1st. Now I bring you to the Barnacle. The Barnacle is a mobilization unit that we use in conjunction with parking. The reason why we went with Barnacle, the Barnacle device is where we use in our heavily travel areas, such as our Main Street District, our Vista, and our Five Points area. Now, the Barnacle does not elude us from doing towing, but it helps us to make sure that we don't stop up traffic in those high desired areas. Now, before a Barnacle can be put on, The enforcement officer must make sure that there's no cracks in the windshield before we install that barnacle. If so, then we will have to move to towing. With the barnacle, we went live on September the 15th, back in 2023. We currently have 6 devices. We have barnacle over 300 vehicles since that time, and our total revenue that we have collected is $85,000. Now we move to our T2 citation collection services. T2 citation collection services, we started that back in January of this year. This right here is something we do with our enforcement unit with T2. This helps us to ensure that those patrons that have parked and have gotten citations that have not paid their citations, after the 61st day, it turns over to the collections unit. At this time, the collection unit of T2, they'll send out letters asking for if this ticket belongs to you or not. If so, you have the right to say that this is not your vehicle or this is not your citation, and they'll direct you to parking services. With that being said, we transferred over 23,000 citations over to collection services, and at this time, we have collected over $300,029 worth of fees.
Let me ask you a question there. Go ahead, Councilman.
What's the difference in that, the T2 services and the barnacle services? I understood you to say that total revenue for that was $85,000.
Yeah, well, the barnacle, the device, the immobilization device, that, say for instance, we put it on your vehicle and you have all these citations. The parker would scan that and they'll bring up the amount that they owe and they'll pay it. Now that goes through, which is tied to our T2, but it goes through another platform of payment.
So, the $85,000, I'm certainly not hung up on the revenue at this point. Services, of course, is important for us in this city of ours. But I was trying to make a delineation between the T2 system and the barnacle system. The T2 system is averaging somewhere about $300 and some odd thousand in revenue.
From the collections, yes, sir.
Okay. Is that doubling the work for the barnacle system?
No, sir.
When we got to do letters and that sort of thing?
We don't do the letters for the collection services does that. The barnacle is an integration with the T2 software. So say for instance, like I said, if you barnacle a vehicle, they scan the QR code and they make their payment. What it does is it uploads into the T2 system. And from there, they'll mark those payments on those citations. It's an integration with the T2 software, but it's a different platform of paying.
And it's immediate, and maybe, I'm sorry, Councilman, explain, Tori, to the immediacy of the barnacle. So the customer, in order to get the barnacle off the vehicle, they're gonna have to pay right then. That's correct.
Yes,
right?
sir. You have to have a smartphone, you can scan or you can call, and you, like I said, you scan the QR code, it brings up, you make your payment, and then from there, it'll give you a code to punch into the barnacle. Once you punch that code into the barnacle, then it releases it. Yes, sir.
Unlike the booths, and those were much more involved, right? So
Correct.
we don't use those anymore.
No, ma'am.
So actually, you got 2 platforms. Is that right?
Technically. But it's integrated into one system.
Okay. All right. I'm fine.
So
I'm sorry.
Let me ask you a question on that. Is T2's our third-party collections agency?
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Correct.
How did we select T2? Did we do an open procurement?
We did not. We used them as a sole source since we were already using T2 and all of their platforms, and we needed something that was going to integrate with their system versus going out and getting something else. So when the idea of the barnacle was brought to us, we had to make sure that we found someone that their system could integrate with. And since we already had T2, it was just an easy fix.
Right, so anybody that doesn't pay their parking violation, their information over a certain amount of period gets turned over to T2 as our collections agency.
Well, Well, in actuality, if they get a parking citation, it's already in T2 if we have their information.
Okay, my question is, do we affect people's credit?
We do not.
Eventually?
We don't.
Okay, that's fantastic to hear. That's where I was trying to get, so that's refreshing to hear. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Moving on to another platform in T2 where we have our citation payments and appeals. This is one of our future projects that we are currently working on. This will allow a parker, say for instance, they get a citation and they're, again, they want to appeal it. They have the option with this to go online right then and there on their cell phone and put in their appeal. They can upload information, they can upload pictures, documentation, or whatever the case may be to support their appeal. So we're moving to this soon. Now I bring you to passport parking. This part of passport is our validation code. This is for our merchants. If our merchants decide that those patrons that patronize their company, their business, they want to give maybe $1 off or maybe $2 off of their parking, they can do that with the validation code. They have the option where they can set up an account. They can put a predetermined amount of money on that account, and then, like I said, they can, set up codes where it's $1, $2, however they see fit, and they can give those codes out to their patrons. Passport parking, text to park. This allows our parkers to text to pay if they like to. They can put in 30843, they can text that. It will bring up the workflow, and you can put your information in. The great thing about passport parking, they do have an option now where you do guest parking, where you don't have to go and put in all the information. You just put in, text that number, put in where you're parking at, that zone number, and then how many hours are you planning on parking. Put that information in and you're finished. This is the revenue portion of the passport parking. We have been with passport parking since 2015. At the current time, since the end of June, we have over 7.7 million total sessions that have been used. We have over 400,000 active users, and we have generated $10.6 million in revenue. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Elle.
Any questions? I hope everyone is a passport parking user. Have the app, download the app. You'll see these posters all across the city and some of our parking facilities and other buildings. Passport parking now is 71% of all of our on-street parking revenue. So we have, again, as mentioned earlier, designated spaces within the city that is only passport parking, but at any meter throughout the city, you can put in your zone number and utilize passport parking, and now we have the text to park, so it does very well here in the city. Also in conjunction with USC. USC uses the passport parking platform, so many of our local visitors and students utilize passport. We're going to jump into now quickly an exciting Main Street project up and coming. Let's talk about the parking along 7 blocks of Main Street. Main Street gets lots of attention here in Columbia. There are a total of 238 parking spaces. 104 of those are parking meters. We have 19 30-minute spaces and 15 loading zones. And you can determine the breakdown by block on the spreadsheet. We're going to propose in 2025 loops along Main Street and/or passport parking. And to ensure everyone understands what paying with a loop experience is, we have a short video we're going to show you. Any questions while we're waiting? And we're going to take a quick look at how one pays with Passport parking before we move forward.
There's a new way to park downtown, and it's super easy. It's called the Passport app.
Simply go to your app store and download the Passport Parking app. It's a simple one-time entry of your credit card number and your license plate number.
Next time you come up to a parking meter, you don't look for your coins. You put in the number that's on the parking meter. You press how long that you want to be there for.
Slide a little bar for time,
You press go.
and you get to park, pay, and be on your way.
Come downtown and have some fun.
So the proposal that we're going to discuss today was created along Main Street. Like I mentioned earlier, this could be proposed for other areas of the city, such as 7 blocks along Sumter. It could be Assembly, but for today's example, it'll be along Main Street. So with regards to the T2 Loop pay stations, we have a couple of options that are highly utilized within the system. One is that Loop pay station that you may see at locations currently throughout the city, and the other is a Cosmo. Both have the solar ability. The Cosmo does not accept cash and coin. Your only payment options with the Cosmo would be Passport or credit cards. The total investment of the Loop pay stations, somewhat more expensive, is $285,000. That includes the power connectivity. And the Cosmos on the slide is the machine on the left. Those are less expensive, coming in at around $223,000. And both offer T2 extend by phone. You'll be able to pay with Passport. The coupon validations all work at both stations. Again, one will just not accept cash and coin. It would be credit card and Passport only. And the other, the current units that we have accept cash. They don't provide change, credit card and Passport.
So would these loops then replace all of the meters?
Yes, ma'am.
Strategically placed, right here.
Yes, sir. There would be, our plan proposed is 2 on each block, 1 on each side of the block, so that you would go to the pay station, pay for your parking, but you are not then required to return to your vehicle, as you saw in the video. So we have all of the meters mentioned along Main Street. That number was 238 meters on those 7 particular blocks. All of those meters would be removed, and you would have 14 pay stations. Another possibility along Main Street in other areas throughout the city as well, whether you're over on Saluda or on Lincoln in the Vista, is we have the opportunity to create a Passport zone, removing all of the meters along Main Street, for example, making the entire 7 blocks Passport parking only, and then putting the loops in other areas. For those individuals that may not have the means to pay with Passport, they could go to a nearby cross block. The next block, pull into one of our parking facilities is also an option if we wanted to utilize the investment of the T2 Lukes elsewhere in the city.
If you went to Passport parking though, then you're gonna have, because right now where we have Passport parking, we got a sign in every space. That's part of what we're trying to get rid of is the meters and all the signage because quite frankly, it's ugly.
So if I may share an example, the Bull
So
Street
I don't know
District
that helps.
is going to be a Passport-only area. We have Passport signs with directional arrows on each end of the block, so you don't have one in each parking space. So I think moving forward, we wouldn't have signs in each parking space. It would be this block, or it could be in the center of a block, depending on the layout, but that would not be the intention to put a Passport sign in every parking space. And
My personal thought is around having Lukes in areas that are highly retail, highly turnover is more important than the Passport, where the Passport utilizes better where people are parking for longer periods of time. Sumter Street, Taylor Street, which, I look at the 25 meters in that one block from the township on, unless there's a show at the township, the majority of those are empty, but the visual. So in areas like that, that makes sense for Passport versus a Luke. But I think where it's Saluda, Vista, Main Street, I think you've got to have a Luke and an option where, because it's encouraging the turnover, and you've got people who need the flexibility from a technology standpoint.
Okay.
That's my thought. Yeah.
On Main Street or Saluda or the Vista.
Yeah.
So right now, we have a block that is just 2-hour parking on Main for free. So if we implement this new infrastructure, how would you prefer us move forward with that?
Why is that one 2 hours for free?
You want to speak to that?
I can. So we have a particular block along Main Street. Many years ago, we created a 6-month pilot. So it's timed parking on this particular block. So you don't pay for parking. We manage the parking on this block by timing you. So you have 2 hours only on this particular block. So all of the other blocks and areas, you have a meter or Passport. We don't have free 2-hour parking except for this one particular block. In our proposal, that block would be included with the 7 along Main Street to receive the Lukes, if that's the direction we move
I
forward.
mean,
How
if
do
it was
you
a
monitor it?
6-month, yeah, but if it was
How
a
do you
6-month
monitor it?
pilot, I don't know why I think we treat it the same.
No,
And I know
that's
whose block
what
it
they
is,
used
but
to
he'll
do.
get
Officer
over it.
Metz
Like,
did, but
it's
they don't
just,
do that anymore.
I mean, it was a
They just
6-month
about
pilot.
won't.
I think what we want to do, though, is bring some market dynamics into this, which is the more premier the parking is, the more we want it to turn, and the more technologically driven it is. And the further away, it's like a bell curve of usage and value. So the more valuable, the more technology you want. And as you get away from, in my opinion, as you get away from it, you kind of gear down the enforcement / technology usage to the point where even at some points outside of the main part of the city, I would like to see it free. So in other words, what I'm getting at is,
We're not there yet.
I know, but I'm
That's
just saying,
what I think that's
in the
what
whole
you're
scheme of
saying.
things, what we
Yeah.
want is this is about value that's forever away that collects no money, well, that even makes even less sense.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think
And I would just add to Councilman Brown's perspective, for the 7 blocks that we're talking about, probably those are the 7 most valuable blocks to park for all of these different storefronts, and perhaps the pricing structure for the garages looks a little bit different. But that being said, no more side-off projects and exceptions moving forward is what I would like to see. If we're going to do something, if we're going to do the time parking, we do it across all 7 blocks. If we're going to do the lukes, do that. Let's get rid of the garbage signage everywhere and really, really narrow down to making it easy for folks to understand, this is how I pay for the spot, this is how long I have. And hopefully that will encourage some of the students and other folks that stay there for a very long time to then move into the garages.
I 100% agree. And besides value, part of this is, you're trying to change bad behavior.
That's correct.
But you also want to Dr. Bussel's point, you also want consistency within the thing, so people don't, have to.
Wonder.
Yeah,
what-
right. You don't
which is
want to make
what-
this too hard. I mean, so a bell curve of value, services, and cost would make the most sense in my mind.
So 2 things I'd like to add to that. One of the biggest complaints that I get from folks is the inconsistency across the different districts. Meaning one entertainment district has different hours and another has different hours in enforcement, this and that. I think looking at a policy that in those high traffic areas is consistent across the city. If we're going to enforce on Saturday, then we enforce on Saturday. If we don't, we don't. Let's make it across the board. I think the second part of that, I think it'd be very interesting, and this may be covered in the study. I'm curious about the pockets that we don't collect.
That's right.
That those, if we're not collecting and we're spending time, efforts, and thing, are we better off making those free parking options or 2-hour free parking options that don't need to be as monitored, or 4 hours, whatever it is? But when I look at the different pockets, when I ride around, I mean, there are pockets where people don't ever park.
And that's because there's no value distinction between parking. So the answer is, you pay the same amount on Sumter Street as you do on Main Street, which makes no sense. And the further away you get, you still pay the same. So part of it is, again, it's a value proposition. And if somebody knows that if you park 3 blocks away and walk 3 blocks, it's cheaper, if not free, then you may get somebody to park 3 blocks away and walk, versus sitting there all day, taking up a spot. So I agree, and I think, sounds like that's kind of where we're headed, but it really is just a concept of the more desirable the spot, the more it costs.
Well, I think I was pushing the envelope a little bit to tee up for the consultant, which I think Mr. Sands is going to get into some of the rationale behind which models work best where and what the recommendations say. But it is very important to us, and we're thankful that you all are being very candid in your thoughts about, because nothing's wrong with time parking. I mean, time parking works in Greenville or other places. I'm not suggesting that it doesn't, but I am suggesting that it has been, to the points that you're making, inconsistent where we've applied these things. And we do, as part of this effort, want to focus on the value, as you've said, of where we need to do what, and the consistency, because I think it does go a long way to people even understanding what am I supposed to do if I'm in a particular part of the city, as well as, yes, that was another thing on my list, to get a little feedback from you on the enforcement piece on Saturdays, because right now it's only Saturday enforcement in 5 points.
Yes, ma'am.
And so we want to talk about that as well.
The example people always talk about, the 2 hours free in Greenville, but Greenville is, the numbers, the volume of people that come in that area
Right.
and when they come in that area are totally different than Columbia.
Right. But I'm saying, of course, some of these things, Mr. Mayor, because obviously this whole discussion, as we would want it to be and expect the public to ask these questions, and if they see or hear something somewhere else, they may not necessarily understand why that would or wouldn't work in Columbia.
But I think it's
But you're
important for
right.
us to build a system that works for Columbia.
That's right.
And be intentional behind that system,
Absolutely.
but also have the explanation behind it.
That's
I mean, we are a different animal than most cities.
Correct.
So while we're on this page, is the only difference between the Luke and the Cosmo cash and coin?
Yes.
Is cash and coin relevant in 2024?
Some places, yes.
places, Probably, yes.
I say that,
but-
knowing I say that knowing that when I park somewhere, I put quarters into it. But if I couldn't, I wouldn't. So I guess what I'm saying is, I do because I can. It doesn't mean I have to. So I wouldn't if I didn't have that option. But yeah, when I park at a place, I immediately get a couple quarters out and I throw it in there.
I think that as long as there are options for cash payers somewhere near the main street, whether it's the garages, I think that's fine. But to make it, like you said, enterprise, highly sought after parking.
Gotta do what you gotta do.
Contactless, yes, the technology will only work if we make it seamless, so.
For those with mobility issues, Elle, are there other models that take that into account? Or you really just have to begin to educate, which is what we plan to do during these
Absolutely.
months leading up to any implementation?
We don't,
And-
our handicap spots don't have meters, correct?
No.
No, the handicap stops at that.
Right, but someone may
But you-
not utilize a handicap space, but they still
may
may
be
have
limited,
mobility
yeah.
issues.
Keeping in mind, if we move forward with either Luke Pay Station, and if that's along Main Street, you're correct in saying there may be adjacent blocks or parking facilities with different payment options. So there is also meters that accept credit cards. So potentially in the future, maybe in some of these areas, we would want a meter that would accept credit cards versus coins. And that's impactful to staff, whether you're reconciliation or collecting the coins and all of the meters that we have today. But we're going to get to dynamic pricing just in a couple of slides. I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, sir.
There are some folk that didn't have a credit card. Or any kind of card.
Yeah, talking to Mike, nobody can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What options are there for folk who got a pocket full of coins, doesn't have a credit card, but they need to park on the street?
We would seek the direction of council. Again, this proposal is along Main Street. So if you're parking on a cross block right around the corner from Main Street, maybe that payment option includes coins. Or you can pull into one of our parking facilities. I'm not sure as a city, it would be, again, the direction of council and the city manager if we remove that option altogether. Perhaps one day, but I'm not sure the industry is there just yet that we remove all ability to pay with a coin. And when you see the dynamic pricing proposal slide, there also, as Councilman Brown mentioned, there will be blocks that are free, that there won't be a fee, and it may not be timed. But that individual perhaps is willing to walk a couple, 3 blocks, and all of that parking then wouldn't fall within the pricing tier.
So we're looking at perhaps 2 devices, one on this end and one on this end of either block, right?
So each block, and this
in between-
proposal.
And in between, you'd have the crosswalks.
So
what I- is
we're
that what-
developing a plan with Public Works where best, and in addition to T2, where to place those. Each side of a block would have one Luke Pay Station. So there are 7 blocks along Main Street. That would be 14 units that we would be purchasing. And where those go, we partner with Public Works and Robert and his team, as well as T2, where they're best served. And as Ms. Wilson said, it is communication, it's informing the public.
And I think your reference about mid-block
Crosswalks.
Councilman, I think that was more in reference to signage and getting rid of like space by space signs, instructing people to use the Luke. But I guess signage that's strategically placed somewhere in each block.
Okay.
Yes, because we don't want to continue down the path of the clutter of all of the signage. We understand.
Elle, does your plan that you're going to put forward, or that you're putting forward, are you going to present any operational changes when it comes to staffing and possible, alternatives?
We can do that. It will evolve. It will evolve as we're moving more towards Luke's, and they are to be maintained, but you won't have staff that are collecting on a regular schedule the coins from the
Well,
meters.
I know from our experience this council and past councils, as we went through the AMI process with Columbia Water, the offset of staffing there, and I think we were very creative and mindful and compassionate about finding new roles for our wonderful workforce. So if that does come up, I feel confident that we'll take care of them, right?
Yes.
Fantastic.
And not that we need to delve into this in too much detail right now, but to Mr. Councilman Brennan's point about even the cross-training now with staff and some of our event management and the other things that we've been doing, which staff has become very excited about, very recent changes, so that's been good.
It has. Cross-training is key. There is an ebb and flow to the parking system here in Columbia that is very much student-based. So obviously, we have some very busy weeks coming up, and the residential permits will expire in December. January will be very busy with residential permits in addition to the students, and those residential permits are only every 2 years. So there is an ebb and flow to the activity and parking services. So this just gives you an overview of some of the pros and cons for the Luke Pay by Block. It would appear that we're moving in that direction. We're super excited. It is smart city technology, and there is a convenience for the parkers. It's easy to use, as you saw in the video. It's a great option for merchants, whether you're doing passport parking merchant coupons. T2 also will provide merchant validations for merchants. Dynamic parking rate options. Both passport parking and the pay by block with the Lukes will offer that dynamic pricing option we'll talk about in just a moment. And again, the elimination, as you mentioned, sir, the on-street meter collections and the reduction in labor hours. Only a couple of challenges. Some of you may have our smart card, looks like a credit card, and you can insert it into a parking meter and pay for parking by that mean. These Lukes don't accept the smart card. So the Lukes don't accept parking tokens. So that would be an opportunity for us. The smart cards do not integrate.
Well, what percentage of parking users still use those?
Small.
That's what I thought. Yeah. Thank you.
So now-
Have we thought about, there's several areas where there's handicap parking. Have we thought about whether or not we give up some of those areas?
For example, I'm unsure I understand your question.
On Main Street? Handicap parking. How doable is that to increase that number some?
To add handicap parking
Yeah.
spaces?
Yes.
We can take a look at that. To my understanding, we do meet the ADA requirements. Keeping in mind, in South Carolina, if you have handicap placard or tag, you can park at any metered space
That's correct.
and not feed the meter. So as during enforcement, if you're parked in a metered space, or timed space, if you're displaying that credential, you would not be timed nor cited for paid parking.
If that is violated, is that automobile barnacled?
If it's violated, so
And you
if,
don't have a placard there?
So if you're in a parking space, and let's say that we cite you, the meter's unpaid, and you are a ADA parker. If you appeal the citation, say, hey, it fell down, I didn't have it with me that day, most of the time, we waive those citations if they provide the credential.
Sounds like Ed's asking for a friend.
Well, I got one.
A little timid, I didn't even know.
Just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Just let us know.
Thank you, Al.
So as you mentioned a moment ago, Councilman Brown, the dynamic pricing tier, this is only an example, and we'll talk a little bit more about that with Mr. Sands in a moment. We recognize the high real estate parking throughout the city, whether you're on Main Street, could be Assembly, it could be Lincoln over in the Vista, could be portions of Gervais or Saluda over in Five Points. And the dynamic pricing tier that we're working on, if during high peak times, hypothetically between 11 and 2, parking along Main Street potentially could be $3 an hour for that peak period to turn over that parking. However, parking over on Sumter Street may be $2 an hour. And if you go further away from that Main Street corridor, it would be free parking. So we're very aware of that, and we're working towards that. Again, it was reviewed in the rate study, so you'll hear more about it. But we are very aware, and again, trying to get those underutilized spaces utilized. Could we pull folks out to park in those areas and walk 2 or 3 blocks?
So does the Luke system, does that give us data from, so does that tell us like occupancy rate and turnover rate and all that? Okay.
Does.
So basically, it's kind of like, so as a former billboard operator, all of our pricing was determined based on metrics. So the metrics were always, we wanted 80% utilization of a billboard. So if a billboard was 100% utilized, we raised prices. If it was 60% utilized, we lowered prices. But we never wanted 100% utilized without raising prices, because that's the way it works. So I think what this would tell us is, these desirable areas, and again, it's really, to the mayor's point, it's just as much about turnover about anything. We just don't want people sitting there all day long, because that hurts the merchants. And I've already gotten a few calls supporting this, but the merchants are, they want this right, and they want it to work. And a lot of them are happy to pay the bills of their customers. So I mean, it's just been interesting even getting a different viewpoint of this from the actual merchants as well. So I like the way we're headed.
The analytics and the dashboard with T2 is pretty phenomenal. Again, it's innovative in getting Columbia over that hump in that innovative technology. So again, backing up to a question earlier, T2 is very well known throughout the world, and they have different components and modules. So when we were discussing citation collection services or the T2s, that all falls under the T2 umbrella. USC also highly utilizes T2. So the platform's there, it's just setting up, those modules already exist, and setting a plan moving forward under that umbrella with the T2 system.
And Elle, to the point, that just made me think about something Mr. Brown mentioned about some of our business owners who would be happy to pay for their customers, or, doing maybe special things for customers when it came to parking. Are there modules that would allow for them to somehow do that? Because I know we wouldn't have the tokens or the smart cards anymore.
Yes, ma'am. So currently with Passport, we do have a couple of clients that are currently using it in providing parking for their clients or customers. And T2 also offers that option. So they would have 2 options, either Passport or T2 with the Luke. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Stacy Dixon. He is our facility administrator, and he's going to tell you a little bit about what's going on in our actual facilities.
Thank you, Stacy. Stacy, make sure you introduce your colleagues.
I definitely will. Thank
Okay.
you, too.
Thank
I want to tell everybody good afternoon. You know, it's a little bit out my wheelhouse, so y'all got to be patient with me.
Come on now.
I got Chris Iser here with Kimberly Horn. I make sure I want to tell him thank you for all your patience and, you know, being there for me through it all. This first slide here is like an overview of everything that we've completed and things that we're working on. The Lady Street parking deck, we've waiting on inspection for one of the elevators now, so it should be up and running at any moment now. Once we complete that, we're moving to Sumter, which that one's already underway. The modernization started on that. And once we complete that one, we're going to move back to Lady to do the other one. The PJ Water deck sealant project, that's complete. You know, glad to get that one behind us. We got one coming up at Lincoln. We did some exterior painting at Lady and Taylor deck. That's complete. At Lady deck, we've done some stairway repairs. And we've done pressure washing at PJ Canning, Sumter, Lincoln. And at Taylor, we also done some improvements as far as, you know, we did some painting, we did some fencing, we did a good little bit of work over there. You know, I think everything looks good on those projects right there. I was going to jump to the next slide. I might need some, okay. With that, that's just like a 5-year overview of all of our, you know, things that we concentrating on. We're really going to concentrate on the structural and life safety stuff. That's where we're going to start at with that. Then the next slide is showing some of the improvements that we made. You know, you can see some painting projects we did at Lady Deck. You can see the elevator, you know, replacement project that we've been working on. And the same thing at Taylor, you know, it's just some pictures just trying to show what the team has done, you know, and moving forward, hopefully we can continually do. And that's the same thing, you know, we got some EV chargers going in, the PJ Canning, that's the water sealant project at PJ Canning, new signing at Lincoln, and just basic stuff. We got, in the slide here, I guess I went too far, but, you know, I want to make sure I tell Forestry and Beautifications thank you too. I mean, they have been a big help on that project at Taylor Street. And as far as me, I think that's it, unless you got some questions.
No, I just want to say thank you, a special thanks to Kelvin, Stacy, the entire team, because they do so much and they're so understated. They do a lot with a little. Sometimes I'll say, y'all, can we do? And they're like, we'll make it work, Ms. Wilson. So I really appreciate y'all's efforts, and the collaboration with Elle, Tori, and their team is amazing. And I will say thank you to the council, because sometimes some of these what seems like to us, just things we knew we needed to do, basic, even created discussion publicly, like about the decks and why would you do it that way. And you just have to push through that. You have to push through the noise. And I appreciate sometimes the staff having to hear the noise, but they keep on going. So I appreciate it.
Thank you too, ma'am.
So one question about the parking decks. So in general, do we want the parking decks to be more long-term parking or to introduce more short-term parking as well?
Probably a combination, but.
Great question. Yes, a combination. So you're going to see some of the proposed rates, hours of enforcement, and what we're proposing differently than we do today in our parking facilities. To be honest with you, I'm unsure on-street parking can accommodate all of the short-term parking needs that we have. All of our facilities have visitor parking. Most are on the lower levels because we just can't meet that parking need on-street. So I think we do need to accommodate both of those groups of people.
And once we determine that, that needs to be a key component of our messaging, because I don't think that the short-term parker is used to parking in a garage. I think they look for the street, and I think they look and they look and they look, and they don't go into a parking garage. And plus, you know, people in Columbia end up with hangovers, so, you know, I still think about trying to park in over there at, I guess it'd be Gervais and Sumter in the parking garage, and you go up five decks and find out there's no spaces. So then, you know, then you don't go up it again. So I think what we have to do is just determine, you know, how we want people to engage parking. And what's the simplest way to do this? I know if I go to Charleston, though, I can park behind Charleston Place, and I'll find a spot.
And you feel good about it, though,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So the first comments I think I made today, and I know you all will continue that message, it is about the customer experience. As we engage short-term parkers who aren't used to going to the decks, to go to the decks, they need to have a good experience when they get there.
But
yeah.
what are our short-term offerings and demand-wise during the week? Now, you can park at any of our decks on the weekend because they're wide open. But that customer, if they go in during the week, are they going to find a parking spot, you know, within the first level?
First of all, I will tell you that if you go up to what used to be the Capital City Club and look out at any time of the day, rooftop parking is available across the city, everywhere. Secondly, I think the experience that you're talking about was just in Louisville not too long ago, and when you're coming in the city, they have points where they tell you what decks are open with parking available. Just a digital sign, but it makes a difference because then you're focused on, I'm not looking for street parking, I'm going to that deck because I know there's a green light and I know there's availability. And I don't know that may be something we should look at, is letting people know the availability
I think
of what's in those
the
decks,
airport-
because it takes
yeah.
away that.
Yeah.
It does. And
Same thing at
the
the
airport's
airport.
done a good job of that, telling you where
But
to park.
it's still that mindset battle.
It is, but it is, but
But
it's exactly
suddenly
right.
Subconsciously, you direct yourself.
It only took us 10 years to chip away at Passport, so I think we can get there pretty soon.
In 20 years, we'll have people parking in the decks.
But to your point, though, you have a bad customer experience, and you're not going back to a deck. You'd rather ride around and find a place. So I think it is important, you know, this gives us a really good opportunity once we roll this out to do that messaging job into, I think the mayor makes a great point of making this as easy as possible. We
you to
know we
find
got
parking.
to, yeah, we know we got to invest. We are investing. You want it to be a good experience. You want it to be safe, clean, and you want somebody to feel like, you know, well, that was easy. And it makes sense versus driving up and down Main Street.
I agree. If I may take a quick moment and recognize Stacy and Calvin, Sandy, that entire team. As we interact with the public on a more regular basis, we are constantly telephoning Stacy, Sandy, and Calvin, and their response time is unbelievable. We couldn't do what we do without their care and looking after our facilities. So, thank you.
With that, we're going to get into the meat of it now?
I think we are.
Let's do it.
She was teeing
So
up.
I'm going to introduce Benjamin Sands. He's with WGI out of Charlotte, and also a thank you to this man. We have worked together for 2 years, ebb and flowed. It's been quite an experience. He's been in the industry quite some time also, and I've learned a lot from Ben. He's learned a lot about Columbia. He's all over the country. He has some great information I'm excited to share with all of you, and look forward to your feedback.
Thank you.
Benjamin?
Thank you, Mayor, Council, City staff. You guys have mentioned a couple times, our saying in the industry is parking's first and last impression, right? First and last impression, users take to and carry from an experience. And so how you brand it, so I've heard you guys talking about it a lot, and I just wanted to kind of insert that little saying that we always say in in our parking industry. So we did a rate study for the City of Columbia. It was really a result of a shortfall on your bond coverage that occurred during the COVID year. But we also used it as an opportunity to just do kind of a full assessment of your parking rates and kind of your operational strategies. Today's presentation will cover a review of the 2015 rate recommendations that were perpetuated as part of the 2015 Parking Master Plan update. We'll go through a peer city comparison to look at parking operations in comparable cities. We'll look at private parking operations in the City of Columbia and what rates those are charging and access they're providing. And then just go through a kind of quick conceptual analysis of how parking revenue rates are calculated and where that all starts and ends. And then go through our recommendations of parking fees and fines and go through debt service analysis and finishing off with just our general recommendations. So in 2015, it's important to note that the recommendations were not implemented as a result of the 2015 study, but the 2015 study did perpetuate a series of recommendations for the City of Columbia to increase its parking rates. They recommended a dynamic parking rate structure with $2 an hour as the top rate for on-street parking, recommended maximum rate increases for the parking decks, bag meter fee increases, and a series of other recommendations that were not adopted at the time. So this is just kind of that breakdown of each of those recommendations. I just went through them, but the deck increases to 15, they stayed at 10. There were some modest changes in the years after the study to the bag meter fees, but they did not adopt the full recommendations that were made in the 2015 study. RFID tags was one of the recommendations, that there's a $5 fee charged for RFID tags. We actually didn't see that you guys were still using those RFID tags, so that recommendation kind of dropped off. 2-year parking rate reviews was one of the recommendations made in the 2015 study. We did not find any evidence that there were any follow-up rate studies that occurred as a result of that recommendation. The other thing was the reinstatement of vehicle immobilizations, which is one of those consequential tools that the Enforcement Division uses to ensure compliance with the posted rules and fees. That was not reinstated until the reinstatement of the barnacle here in recent history. So just going through your on-street and off-street rates. In general, you're averaging $85 for off-street unreserved and $105 for reserved parking. It's important to note that a reserved parking space takes that space out of the pool of shared use. So the more reserved spaces you have, the less general public parking spaces you have available. And so you lose out on the efficiencies of the shared use. On-street meters are still charging 75 cents an hour, and there are several garages that utilize that on-street meter technology on their ground levels to charge that same on-street rate in the ground level of the garage. So looking at our peer city updates, I heard some conversation about Greenville and about this pilot that you implemented on Main Street, which sound very similar, like you guys were trying to think about maybe doing a Greenville-style parking for on-street. And actually, I have some history with the city of Greenville. I actually interviewed for their parking manager position back in 2007 and met with the city manager when they were having this big conversation about their on-street rates. And the city manager at the time basically established that because of the businesses and their concerns about chasing away business by charging fees for on-street, that they wanted to perpetuate a process that ensured that there was constant turn of the space without establishing fees, so that they didn't, in essence, hurt the businesses. So they came up with a pretty robust enforcement process where you get a certain amount of time-limited parking within the central business district, but they heavily enforce throughout the course of the day to ensure compliance with those turns. And if you are on street more than 2 hours or more than that time limit in downtown Greenville, you will get a ticket. And after your first ticket, it gets more expensive with the second, third, and fourth. So it sounded like very similar to what you guys tried to implement in your pilot period on Main Street. And that is one philosophy that we've seen across the United States in terms of removing parking fees as a sense of inhibitants to economic vitality. It's really a philosophical discussion for council to decide what the best use of that is. Your system is a monetized system where you have assessed a value for that on-street space, and unfortunately, that value hasn't really kept up with consumer price index increases over the past year. Just since 2014, we've seen a 30% increase in consumer price increases, while your rates have remained flat throughout that period. Just looking at peer cities, just in terms of on-street rates, your on-street rates are lowest. Your monthly deck rates are the lowest. Well, exception of Greenville, which doesn't charge for on-street. But for the on-street environments, you are charging less than most of your comparable cities. And your daily rates in your garages are also lower. It's important to note, and we'll get into this as we look at the private market analysis for the City of Columbia. City of Columbia by far controls the most public parking in the city. Other cities like Charlotte, for instance, the city controls only a nominal percentage of the market share of public parking, where private entities control the significance of public parking. In the City of Columbia, you by far control the most parking, and it's reflected with how the private operations have reacted to your market share, right? By introducing things like tenant-only parking rules, higher rates than yours. They're essentially pushing parkers away from their establishments and more towards yours. I actually scouted the City of Columbia when I was in private operations about 15 years ago, and we made a value decision to not pursue the City of Columbia because the on-street rates were so low that we couldn't establish a high enough rate for off-street to be able to support expanding a business into Columbia at that time. Even though we had several property owners at the time that were interested in monetizing their space for parking, the rates that the city was charging basically established what we could charge in private operations. And that gets into that conversation about the curb and value of the curb, right? The curb by far is the most valuable real estate the city manages, provides direct proximal access. The use of that curb space for private property storage is a decision by council, not dissimilar from that decision about fees. Over time, our cities and communities have established that, private vehicle storage on street is the standard, is the norm. Communities are now starting to kind of reassess that as they're looking at mobility options and equity and providing more walkable districts and those types of things. So the value of the curb has continued to increase, and so the rates should increase. And the curb and the on-street environment, it's important that we talk about that first because that's what establishes the rates for the off-street environment. The curb being the most proximal to any given destination in terms of space. As you start to move away in terms of proximity to your given destination, the value drops. So what you charge at the curb sets the table for what you charge in off-street, and then that off-street daily rate is kind of how you get to your monthly rates, right? As you start to look at typical usage patterns and establish kind of a matrix similar to these examples that are provided in the slide here, on how to calculate a monthly rate. So you can see that City of Columbia has a pretty aggressive strategy for discounting monthly rates. You even have a very, very high discount for reserved parking, which we would certainly encourage you to diminish because of that shared space conversation that I mentioned earlier. But this is the standard by which the rate calculation starts, which is how on-street parking is valued and charged.
So how do we, I'm sorry, how do we monitor a reserved parking spot versus an unreserved parking spot?
Typical industry practice is that a reserve space is kind of self-monitored, right? Is that until you identify somebody's in your space that's not supposed to be there, that's how it's managed, right?
And in your professional kind of experience, have you seen this many rate structures for reserved parking spots? There's so many.
Yeah, there is some absence of uniformity in your approach. Certainly agree with that. We did go through and do certainly agree that not all portions of Columbia function the same way, and they do not all experience the same demand for parking. And price is a reflection of demand. And so what you'll see in our rate recommendations is that we start to break the City of Columbia into districts. And so we created 5 districts with the city, including the downtown district, Vista Parking District. Sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. Vista Parking District, Bull Street District, USC, Catawba Parking District, and the 5 Points. Each of these areas functions completely differently from the others and has different demands for parking. And by creating these districts, you give yourself some flexibility to be able to establish different operational processes, rates, and constraints, management of demand. Control is what enforcement is, right? Parking enforcement is a mechanism for control and assurance of compliance with the posted rules. So enforcement, we would always recommend, is necessary when you're at your peak demand cycles, and that may vary by given district. So we'll jump into just the downtown district, which is our first one. Recommendation here was to move the current 75 cents per hour rate for on-street parking to $2 per hour. Taken in the context that occupancy predicates what the rate should be, so that this is based on an assumption that your downtown market is running at a very high level of occupancy. In the full document, we provided a performance-based tiered pricing example whereby basically occupancy predicates what the rates are and how much enforcement is necessary. Our initial recommendation here is to move the 75-cent rate per hour to $2 just to keep up with the market changes that have occurred since rates were implemented more than 10 years ago. But we do recommend that the city continue to monitor the key performance indicators of occupancy and revenue and compliance, and then adapt their policies and rates to suit the curve. So our downtown district, our recommendations here were to move to $2 per hour on the on-street. I'm sorry, I already said all that. and to move.
Did you recommend hours and days?
We did recommend an expansion of enforcement during downtown, for the downtown to go to 11 hours per day.
And weekends?
Based on occupancy. So our initial conversations back in the first stages of this was that the weekend occupancy in downtown didn't predicate the necessity for enforcement, while in some other portions of the city, for instance, 5 Points, it did. So our recommendation at that time was that there not be enforcement on the weekends for downtown. But that was based on an understanding that there was low occupancy in on-street environments during that time period. If that condition has changed, then that recommendation obviously would be adapted.
Have we not? I thought we know what the conditions are now. Yeah. Okay.
And, you know, these investments that you're making in the Lukes and LPR enforcement process and your passport, these are all data sources that can then be aggregated together to give you these key performance indicators. Whereas coin-operated single-space meter is an analog device that doesn't perpetuate any data transfer. So unless you're capturing it through a manual process, the ability to get data out of a single-space meter is difficult. In general, we're recommending to transition monthly rates, which I did not say in the last slide, apologies, or transitioning monthly rates for reserved from 105 in general to 125, and from, in general, between 78 and $50, and this varies by site here. We made recommendations to transition the self-park unreserved rates to 85 and 55 respectively for this zone. I think one of the important parts here too to talk about is as we make this recommendation for the on-street spaces, we're also making a recommendation for a first hour free for the garages, right? And I think that speaks to that conversation about providing an incentive to take some of those short-term parkers that may have some equity issues or may not want to pay for that proximal space. You're providing them a resource here for them to go into an off-street lot and park for that first hour for free.
Do you see that a lot in other municipalities you've worked with?
It varies by their want for development and economic vitality and quite honestly by the demand, right? Some of these communities have had a real doom loop that's occurred as a result of the COVID cycle. And so they're really fighting to get people back into their downtowns. And so they've taken what was a really high-priced parking system and they're starting to introduce these hours-free
And that's in the
incentives. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that might be a good way to change that philosophy, that mindset. Is to say
And it's
you
also
can park in the deck for free for an hour.
Yeah. And it gets people away from thinking that on-street space should be free.
That's good. 'Cause
It gets them to start
the airport
valuing
gives
that
you
curb.
that 20 minutes free, but that's never, they always get you.
Mhm.
They always get you on the 20 minutes.
The key for the garages is how many spaces are really available.
Right.
And that's really a big part of it is.
The green light.
Yeah. So, but driving people to a parking garage when there's no spaces in there is not going to do any good.
Okay. Any questions on downtown district? Next district's 5 points. 5 points, again, we're also recommending that transition from 75 cents per hour for on-street parking to $2 per hour. We are recommending weekend enforcement since these are the periods where you are seeing peak demand. 5 points was actually the area I scouted for a private property owner 10, 15 years ago when I was here. And so they saw the wave that you guys have had in that quadrant in terms of the development and demand for parking in that space.
Why would you not use dynamic pricing in an area like that? So when they're slow, between 3 and 5, why wouldn't it be cheaper? And during peak times from 11 to 2 and 5 to 8 or whatever, or higher?
We would certainly encourage that, and our full study did recommend that we use this tiered pricing system. We didn't have the benefit of kind of that varied occupancy map to understand the different time periods that you were seeing lower demand there. We would certainly agree that, you know, implementing a tiered system like that does encourage but it's all based on your technological capabilities. Remember that when we started this study, we were working without the benefit of the Lukes and the benefit of some of those advanced technologies. So we were working with the constraint of how do we make those single-space meters generate more income? And
That's a
what's
future
the
art project.
boat anchors, we call them.
So does the potential city commitment to the Lukes change every recommendation you would make?
It provides for the augmentation of those recommendations, right? I think you would still start out at these rates, but now you have the ability to adapt and adjust based on the KPIs that the system's pumping out, right? As you start to get good data back and you start to see, I mean, I'm
How
a
long does
big,
it take to get good data back?
I mean,
A
if
week,
I,
a month, a year?
oh, no, I mean, you're going to start to see data flow occurring
can tell the highs
in
and
real
lows of
time, yeah,
demand and-
yeah. So, I mean, it's based on those plate scans and just the data transfer that's occurring from the off-street environments. And so I think your off-street still has some old gated technologies, right? So that data might not be that forthcoming, but as you introduce Lukes and passport parking across your zones, these are data sources that are built for aggregation and will give you good comprehensive pictures of occupancy, utilization, and revenue streams. So, moving past the on-street rates, for off-street, the current rates for unreserved are $20 to $25. We're just recommending that we transition those rates to $35. For the garage, we're recommending that we move from the $2, or actually, we're keeping the $2 rate the same for the first hour. And then 22 for the daily maximum. I'm sorry, I might have a typo here. I thought, yeah. We had recommended free for the first, do we have a typo in there? Yeah.
Yes, we're going to do free for the first
Yeah. Okay. But this lot that's right. It's a lot, not a deck, sorry. Okay. So for the lot, we're recommending an expansion from the $10 maximum to a $22 maximum using an accrued. Now, your Lukes will definitely be able to do this, right? We'll be able to accrue to these maximums. With the coin-operated units, which was when we made these recommendations, you would need to expand your enforcement to ensure that you were generating that amount of revenue for that time period, right? Okay, moving on to the USC Catawba District. We only have one parking location in this area, and it was charging a $36 monthly rate, no daily rate. We're just recommending that we switch this to $45 from $36, and moving that on-street rate from 75 cents per hour to $2 per hour.
Wait, time out. Elle, is this the area around Campus Village?
No, sir.
Would that be in the USC Catawba District?
It is not. This is only one surface lot that is across the street on Catawba from Richland County School District. And there are some new apartments in the area. So the parking that's utilized currently in this area is currently leased by Richland County.
But the passport around the USC Campus Village is in this shaded area.
Right, but we are only referencing this particular surface lot with this rate change. You'll see.
Talk about on-street for this district?
Yeah, we have a recommendation to transition it from 75 cents per hour to $2 per hour.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Moving on to the Vista District. Again, for the on-street, recommending transitioning from 75 cents per hour to $2 per hour. In general, we wanted to also encourage you to stay with flat dollar amounts and rates, especially as you transition to Lukes. Coin has become more and more expensive, not only to collect, but to deposit. Banks have started to charge deposit fees for coin. So moving away from coin, first of all, coin creates the most wear and tear on your hardware. So any effort you can do to move away from coin will benefit your bottom line in terms of maintenance costs over time. So current off-street rates for the Vista District for monthly reserved are around $80, $65 for the unreserved, $10 daily maximum, $2 first hour, $1 each additional hour. We're recommending that those transition to $105 for a monthly reserved, $78 to $80, depending on the site. We've got a lot here, 1429, that we're recommending an $80 rate versus the 2 decks where we're recommending a $78 rate for the unreserved monthly. Moving that daily maximum to the $15 daily maximum, giving a first hour free, and additional hours after that first hour would be $1. So it's important to note that a parker would have to be in a facility for 14 hours or 15 hours to achieve that $15 daily maximum. So we don't anticipate that they'll achieve that daily maximum unless they're storing their vehicle for multiple days.
So are we trying to drive the consumer to a reserved or an unreserved spot? What's our thinking behind the two?
We would encourage you to drive them to the unreserved and to slowly curtail the offerings of reserved spaces because of the detrimental effect it has to the shared use capacity and inventory for each of your facilities.
Because if I have a reserved spot, I'm not there, it's
unused.
It's theoretically, yeah.
Yep.
That's why those roof spots are open, right?
So, okay, so under
Parking
that.
is not a problem downtown. If you take a look and you look at all the empty lots all over the city, the rooftops, this and that, if you just
It's just getting the right person to the right parking
walk,
spot.
half a block,
It's the right person, right, it's the right person to the right spot. So I guess based on the implication that we don't want reserved spots, should we make a reserved spot more expensive than even you're currently recommending? Again, changing behavior.
No,
So
agreed.
If I'm going to buy something, no matter what I'm buying, when I go into the store, I usually narrow it down to, so I can buy that or I can buy that. And then I look at that price and then I look at that price and then I say, I'll take one or the other, depending on what I see as value. So if that's what we want to do, then we should really think about that, because.
We also don't control some of the surface lots that we wish others
I know.
would demonstrate the same philosophy.
Yeah.
Right, so.
So anyway, we don't have to worry about that today, but I would strongly consider as part of this, it's value and behavior is really the two things we're focused on equally.
In private parking, we would oftentimes charge double what an unreserved space is for a reserved
Well,
space.
You've given somebody an option that's, you got to think for a minute before you do it. If it's $20 a month, and I'm a lawyer downtown, and I'm like, okay.
but I also think that we have a responsibility to have a rate structure that is also, we're not the private sector, we're the public sector.
No, but that's what I'm saying. but-
Having a distinct fee higher for reserved has always been the case. The question is what's the delta?
Yeah.
And I think the metric has always been 50% somewhere in there for reserve versus from.
That's only, that's commonsensical. It's just not necessarily,
Commonsensical.
yeah, I made that up. Ed told me that word.
Stealing your words,
Yeah,
Ed.
Ed told me that one. So, but only if it works. So the answer is, if it doesn't actually change behavior, then it doesn't work.
Well, I think for me, the first step in all of this is to have some consistency across the board, you know, and,
It would be helpful, yes.
yeah.
Hey, let me ask you something with your Charlotte experience. Off-street parking in a private deck versus a public deck in Charlotte. For example, it's $2 here, potentially, within the municipality of Columbia. What is it, ballpark, public off-street in Charlotte versus private?
It's not really fair comparison because the two public garages in Charlotte, one of which is the Charlotte Mecklenburg Government Center, is directly adjacent to the judicial complex and not in the central kind of corridor where all the demand occurs. And the second garage is the county garage, which is down there adjacent to the jail. Again, not directly proximal to.
So they don't have public, like in the hospitality major?
Right,
major
it's all private parking
Was that a
there.
municipality decision long, long time ago to leave it open for private investment and to fill that private demand?
Well, I think just the parcel owners there that developed their towers realized that there was a market for parking. I think the establishment of that 277 highway loop, which kind of constricted development into kind of a core downtown, kind of inflated the value of space in that area, right? And
They
through
just
that.
said no, is what he's trying to say. They just said if you want a parking deck, you build it. I mean, you
Right.
get the revenue for it. They limited their investment in parking because they didn't need to do it.
Well, I think also as we get our hands around demand, I mean, we can roll that out to private developers, say the demand's there.
I think in the future, we're gonna see more private developing parking
Agree.
than public.
And they, I remember as Charlotte was developing, they had this sea of surface lots that was kind of surrounding their central core. And they actually had to pass an ordinance at a certain point to stop tearing down historic buildings to build parking lots, right? Because that was what was occurring because there was such a strong market for parking. So moving on from the Vista District, our last district was the Bull Street District, which predominantly serves the minor league ballpark. For this one, it's currently a free or time-limited on-street environment. We recommend either continue to perpetuate the time limitations or introduction of a $2 per hour fee as with the rest of the city. And the variable there is your occupancy. And now that you're getting good data or starting to generate good data, it's just directly reflective of how the space is being used. At the time of the report, the monthly unreserved rate was $65. I'm sorry, yeah, monthly unreserved rate was $65. And we are recommending that transition to $125.
Why is the recommendation daily first and second hours free?
I think that was in keeping with some of the development agreements, and I'd have to defer to Elle there, but there was some agreements or easements there with some development entities that predicated some portion of time that was free. Can you speak to that with Bull Street in terms of the first and second hour free?
To my understanding, there is an agreement with Hughes Development that goes years back, that only in the parking facilities themselves, not on-street, the first 2 hours are free.
And how long is that agreement for?
We're working on that. But that does not apply to on-street parking. So again,
Well, you can't park on street down there barely right now because of construction.
Two blocks.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I get it, maybe, but we're at a point now that we've got significant investment in parking decks and facilities there. And, if we're going to do a first free hour across the city, then it should be consistent there too. They shouldn't be different from the other districts. We've subsidized that district heavily.
We'll have the opportunity to talk to you more about it.
All right.
In general, I think the concept of extra monitoring of free makes no sense to me. So free should be free and unmonitored, and then something should be charged and then monitored. So to have resources to go around to monitor the freeness of parking makes no sense to me.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes,
Mr. Mayor?
sir, Mr. Bailey.
Just for clarification, there's no sunset clause on that? Because I heard a response saying that we're working on it.
Yeah, No, sir, to answer your question directly, and the original agreement is written that way without a sunset, but we're working on it. So
Thank you.
we'll talk with you more about it.
Any more questions on Bull Street? Next slide is just going to go through your current violation fees for enforcement. This is a pretty extensive list. I'll call out a couple of specific citations here that we noted, but parking improperly at a $7 initial fine, $10 late fee after 30 days, and then a $17 60-day late fee. There were some real inconsistencies here with the late fees, and some of the initial fine amounts were so nominal that it could technically be seen as kind of encouraging testing of the system. At a $7 rate or an $8 rate for parked overtime, in many cities, that is the hourly fee.
So just to add to that point, I've had several people in the last few weeks tell me that they've never put any money in a meter in Columbia, South Carolina.
Yep.
For that very reason. It's risk management, that if you get a ticket, that overrides the fact that you've never actually put money in a meter.
There's a lot of gamesmanship in parking, unfortunately.
Well, I'm losing then. Hey, so what is the refeeding meter? What does that mean?
Refeeding meter typically, and Elle, you can clarify if I'm saying this wrong, but it's when you've exceeded the time limit that the meter was designed for and you've gone back in and fed it again to basically like you're starting a new session, although it may be a time-limited space. So for instance, if you have a 3-hour space with a meter, you overstay your 3-hour, but you went back and fed that meter for supplemental hours. Is that correct? That's correct.
So why in the parking industry is that a bad thing?
Your fees are charged on street to try and encourage the turn, right? And so you want to move those sedentary vehicles to less proximal spaces to free up those close proximity curb spaces for easy access to your main street corridor and businesses. And so that would be the premise there, is that you wanted to get those, that's a sedentary vehicle, it's overstayed its time limit, and it's attempting to back into a longer stay.
So is that like a blanket policy, or that nice colored grid you did of Main Street, where Main Street is I think it's blue or whatever? I mean, I feel like everything outside you should be able to refeed.
Yeah, and that is certainly part of that dynamic adjustment of your policies by block based on how they're being
I've gotten
utilized.
calls about the inability on Passport to do a refeed. And I guess it's because they were parked maybe on a certain part of Main Street, but is the refeed an umbrella policy we have? Okay, just in the high demand areas? Gotcha, perfect, thanks.
And Passport would more than likely have logic programmed in to not allow you to extend a 3-hour space beyond 3 hours. And so,
If it's in a high demand area.
And so when they set up the Passport zones, when they designed those zones that were in the time-limited areas, basically would have said a user cannot go past a 3-hour time limit.
Let me ask you a question.
Certainly.
We're talking about the parking situation. What about those persons who are, and I've had folks ask me about this, when they're paying their taxes for their automobiles, and there's a parking fee on either side of Hardin, and I think that's Washington Street. Why are they ticketed when they're paying a bill?
Because they're not feeding the meter.
No, that's not my point. That's not my point. The point is, it's almost like double taxation. I got to feed the meter, pay the tax bill.
Yeah, but the tax bill doesn't go to us.
Let the guy answer the question.
Well, I'm not sure that he's qualified to answer that
But
question.
somebody ought to be qualified.
So-
Folks run into that situation all the time. I mean, if it's not a question you can answer.
No, I mean, there's all ways to skin that, right? You can introduce 15, 20-minute spaces, short-term spaces like that for,
Those kind of options are doable. That's what I was getting
Yeah.
at. When the average person go pays his or her vehicle taxes, is there some wiggle room in there where they could, with 15 minutes or 10 minutes is allotted for the, to pay that tax?
The county has a garage there that they could have those spaces in there.
But you got meters on the streets, don't you?
Right, because they don't
That's
want,
not
they,
county.
they don't want people parking there. The reason they put those meters there is because the proximity to the neighborhood and the schools and people and employees parking in the street, then not allowing parking turnover for people who are actually going in there to pay. Because that was the whole premise around that.
And then the option, I guess, too, would be for them to park in the surface lot, which isn't monitored by the city. That's the county's surface lot behind the
My
building.
position is that there aren't any options, and there ought to be some options
On the
so
city side.
on the city side, that's correct.
I would purport that you can scale your grace period, right? And so a
that's gonna
grace
be the
period,
argument for every merchant, though, moving forward, on
Yeah.
everything. Every merchant's gonna say, the spaces in front of mine ought to be 20 minutes or
25
30
minute grace
minutes free, because people are running in.
On the city side, there is a meter there.
Right, but so is it in Five Points, and so is it in Main Street, so is it on Sumter Street, so is it in the
Everybody ain't
Vista.
paying taxes in 5 Points.
They're not?
He's saying to go in to pay your car taxes or whatever, to handle your
Right.
business,
But
your
my
county
point,
business.
my point is, the county has a deck
A deck
correct.
and a surface lot.
and a service lot that they can provide that parking for. The reason the street meters are there to keep people moving.
I think there ought to be some options. If it's a 15-minute delay, fine.
I mean, I think that's a county issue.
I don't know if it's a county issue or not, then. I think that it's a dualistic issue. It's a county issue and a city issue. And until we are able to differentiate that, then I think that's going to be a game changer.
so I have actually run into this before, where we have county, people showing up to do county business, and the city and the county are sometimes not on the same page. And so the city ends up enforcing on those people that are doing business for the county. Typically, that's, they work that out to create either signs that communicate that those on-street spaces, that there is no grace period for parking, okay? Or they can build in a scalable, what we call a grace period, right? Which is a period before which I will enforce the rules, right?
And I
I'm not-
think during when it's time for voting, or you can speak to that, Tori.
That's
I don't know
what
if
I
that
was getting
would, I
ready to
mean,
bring
we
up.
do work with the county on that.
Yeah, we work with the county, but to speak to what you're saying, with people coming to pay their taxes, and we do sometimes issue tickets if they stay over. However, we do work with the county. We work with the county, like say for instance with voter. People coming to vote, the county reaches out to us and they will ask us to bag the meters on Hampton Street. And they will also use those other meters to, like for those that are driving up that have ADA issues where they can do the drive-through. So the county will reach out to us about those meters where, for voting. But far as, people going to pay their taxes, everybody pays the meter. And we haven't had any issues or complaints in reference to that.
Well, there has been conversation, I've had conversation with.
Yes, sir.
Well, I think there ought to be, again, I'm opposed from this, there ought to be some option. And Neil, I'm gonna put this in your hands. If we could create some options Everybody gotta do that, and everybody gotta visit that building. On the city side, I think. Let's talk about some options, let's think about it.
So the slide you see here is our recommendations for revised enforcement fines and fees, as well as parking enforcement times by district. I would say that these enforcement times were generated during that 2022 to 2023 year. So as conditions may have changed since then, there may be some necessity to reevaluate some of those enforcement time recommendations. But in general, you can see by the difference between the initial fine on the current column compared to the recommended column that we've made some somewhat abrupt adjustments to the parking enforcement fines. Most specifically, I would call your attention to parking overtime fee, which we're recommending going from $8 to a $20 initial fine. We also recommended that, with the exception of handicap parking, that we move to a kind of a flat fee, late fee on 30 and 60-day recurring cycles of $25 for all citations. Made some distinct adjustments to the fire lane, for instance. This is another one where we were seeing that the rate was so low that it was kind of encouraging compliance issues. So we moved that fire lane rate from $20 to $100. We also have the reserved parking only fine in here that was $20 before and now will be $75. I think the important thing to focus on with the parking enforcement fines and fees is that they are not intended to generate income. They're intended to generate compliance. And that the parking enforcement fees, what you're charging for those enforcement activities, which is typically a losing proposition. You have to send people out there to check on the vehicles, write the tickets. It's not done for profit, it's done to ensure compliance with the posted rules. So we believe that these enforcement fine fees will generate a higher level of compliance and an expectation by the community that the rules are always in effect. Just going by districts in terms of the parking enforcement periods, we recommended downtown, we had a 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Current Monday through Saturday enforcement. We're recommending that go to an 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Saturday enforcement, or essentially 2 hours more per day. 5 Points, currently 11 a.m. till 6 p.m. Monday through Saturday, recommending going to 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Saturday, or an added 2 hours per day. And that follows trends through USC Catawba District, which is 9 to 6, going to 8 to 7, similar to downtown, and Vista with the same recommendation. Bull Street, which was in transition at the time of the recommendation, we're recommending implementation of an 11-hour Monday through Saturday, 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. enforcement period. Any questions on parking enforcement fines and times?
Explain the difference, Ben, about 5 Points one more time with the 10 instead of.
5 Points, I think we just went to 7 p.m. and, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. You're currently enforcing till 6 p.m. We encouraged you to go till 7 p.m. Monday through Saturday, just to expand that period of enforcement to encapsulate your peak demand period. We understood that the 5 Points.
So the morning hours aren't considered peak and 5. What's the difference between the morning hours of enforcement versus the rest of the city?
When you start enforcement at 11, your staff will arrive at the site somewhere around 11:30 and start their enforcement behaviors. So they don't that activity won't curb any demand for the lunch period. By starting an enforcement at 10 a.m., you have the system in place and being regimented as the lunch hour.
My question is, why do we not start at 8 like the other areas of the city?
Just because of information provided by Parking Services that there wasn't demand to support that activity at that time.
But there is all across everywhere else in the city. I didn't catch that before, I'm sorry.
So talking about parking permits and special fees. Again, we have a current column which reflects the current fees being charged and the ways in which those fees are charged. And then we provide a recommendation. So let's just start with loading zone permits. This permit was so underpriced based on what we saw, that it was, I believe she was getting a very large proportion of requests for this loading zone permit. And we needed to make it a premium that they charge more per year for these loading zone permits so we curtail some of the abuse of this permit. Similarly, with valet permits, the rates don't reflect the accrued value of the space that those valets are taking, so we adjusted that rate in coordination with Parking Services to more closely reflect what the value of the space is taken in terms of potential generated revenue for the city. Bag meter fees, this is an excessively laborious task on the part of Parking Services, and the $10 rate previously charged did not capture enough revenue to support the labor necessary to perpetuate this activity. We matched up the rates through our recommendations to more closely or more appropriately encapsulate the labor intensivity of the activity of bagging meters.
In a bag meter situation like that, should that not be reflective of dynamic? So if you're on Main Street in the middle of a whole bunch of people's work life and you're doing that, obviously you're paying more, but if you're pulling meters off Taylor Street that nobody parks at, you shouldn't have to pay the same amount. I think that'd be something to think about. Create it the same way for the demand and the need.
What's the point of a bag meter?
So that somebody can use that parking spot. So a construction company like where the Moxie was, for example, they had, what, four spots taken out? So that those construction workers had a place to park.
Film crews, I understood, were using that for doing filming and those kinds of things.
Events, construction dumpsters, short-term.
Let me ask you something. If there is a desire for us to go towards more of a dynamic parking structure in the future, once we understand demand and everything, would it be in our best interest to start with enforcement hours in the 5 or 6 districts that we look to create, all with the same times, basically from 8 to 7?
I mean,
Or is that
I'm never
something-
going to argue with more data, right? The more data you have, the better decision you make. We tailored those enforcement periods to be reflective of the activity that we perceived through our discussion with Parking Services. I consider enforcement to be data gatherers, right? So they're establishing what your occupancies are on street as they patrol through the city. So having an extra 2 hours of data for a district basically can tell you when it starts to change, right? So I don't disagree that a uniform 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., for instance, to incorporate the 5 points as well. It wouldn't hurt you. It just may not be as productive.
I know it says in transition even for Bull Street, but data shows even the morning hours out there now, 8. I don't know about that yet, but maybe soon. Okay. This fall.
But don't you think, Ms. Wilson, a lot of that's resident-driven right now? The folks that are living in those apartments or parking on the streets or their guests?
Well,
I mean, I guess
Yeah.
that's also something to understand is, since
That-
we have limited off-street parking requirements in our urban core,
Right.
how much is that an overflow of resident guest parking for the residents? Because I think at the end of the day, we do want to see more density in our residential offerings downtown. So we should be mindful of how that works into getting a ticket at 8 a.m., you know, on Main Street. You know.
Let's look at that a little closer again, but, or do you want us to go ahead and speak to it? Okay.
Some of that is residentially based over in the Bull Street district, but we have a bank, we have offices that are having meetings, we have restaurants, gyms coming online. There's a lot of activity, so I think that we could utilize the turnover of that space as that district continues to grow, and I believe the plan is the on-street parking will be implemented in October.
Well, I think the same is true for Main Street as well. You know, it's kind of a pain to get up at 8 a.m. and go move your car if you're parked on Main Street or a block off. So I think just the same mindfulness that we're creating in Bull Street is happening now on Main Street, so that we should probably mirror those as well.
Okay.
That's kind of my point.
Okay.
Back to permits and special fees. See several adjustments to permit fees here. For instance, the downtown resident currently being charged at $40 per year. We're just recommending a nominal increase to $50 per year for the downtown resident permit. In and out monthly parking, currently charged at $35 per month, recommending a transition to $50 per month. These resident permits derived by owner and tenant, these were, once again, very low rates for resident permits, both for the owners and the tenants. Resident permits were valid for 24 months, and resident permits were valid for 6 months and needed to be renewed every 6 months. We're not recommending any changes to that cycling, but we are recommending pretty dramatic changes to the fees charged for owner permits and tenant permits for residents, and that is going from $5 per vehicle for 24 months to $120 per vehicle for 24 months. So that is by far the biggest increase. And then a $10 rate for tenant residents, going to $90 per 6 months per vehicle. It is important to note that $120 is a rate for a 24-month permit.
Which I think's a problem.
Yeah.
I think it's got to be an annual basis. That people are moving, and I think the tenant, it needs to be 12 months. Nobody signs a 6-month lease. It should be based on the lease, not a 6-month period. I mean, we're creating more work for ourselves than we should. You present a lease to get that, correct? So whatever that lease says, if it's 12 months lease, 6-month lease, that's the way that should be valid for that. I mean, I think if we're trying to do it, we're just creating too much work there. And, you know, the residence permits, almost all of those residents have driveways as well. So, I mean, I think the rate should be the same for the resident as for the tenant, because you're paying two different tax structures as well. Tenant's paying more to live in that house than the homeowner is. The homeowner has options on their own property as well, so I think it needs to be balanced. I think they should mirror each other. I think the permit is the permit cost, whatever you determine that to be. If it's, you know, whatever, $60 a year or $90, it doesn't matter, but I think it's got to be consistent.
I do have a question too. What was the rationale behind 6 months for tenants?
We were simply taking the previous structures that were in place and simply extending them forward.
Because I would think in between residential or commercial rentals, that there wouldn't be a 6-month lease out there to correspond with that.
Elle, is there a list of areas that have permanent residential parking in our info pack.
I'm sorry, could you repeat your question?
Do you have a list of the residential permit areas in our packets?
No, sir, I can easily provide that.
Okay, great, thank you.
So, Mayor, I will take your comments to also be attributable to the visitor passes, which we're about to go into.
I think they got to mirror
Yeah,
each other.
So,
I think we're just
One
we're
year-
creating too,
Yep.
it's too complicated.
and then
It doesn't need to be that
uniform
way.
rates.
Well, just ease on staff, too.
Yeah.
And we did not recommend that you make a change to the hospitality roof rate, predominantly because it's currently underutilized, as the mayor noted in his earlier comments. So moving on to the premise for the study, as you can see here in this chart, we've charted out revenues, expenses, and the bond coverage requirement, which is the solid blue line that is running across the graph. And as you can see in 2021, where that green line traverses the solid blue, your bond coverage slipped during that COVID year. It immediately rebounded under the current rate structure in 2022 and 2023. So it's important to note that adoption of some or all of the recommendations will have a positive impact to the financial position of the city parking system and provide significant benefit terms in terms of current operating expenses, addressing deferred maintenance, and expanding capacity, improving technology. So, taking the rate recommendations, we were asked to create a forecast of what those rate recommendations would mean in terms of potential revenue changes for the city. So we established this chart here that tracks your historical revenues from 2019, 2020, all the way through your budgeted year of 2023, 2024, and then projects out for 2024 and 25 with expanded rates, understanding under the assumption that we're accepting all the rates, right? We made estimations of what those revenue totals would come to. I think it's important to note that this does exclude any outside factors that could change parking demand, introduction of new supply, employment changes, or other larger macro changes to the city's development plans.
And to underscore that the projections are in line with the CIP presented by Stacy earlier to meet the needs for the decks and the continued discussion about the customer experience. So the need for the rates to increase, to make the adjustments and necessary improvements for infrastructure, thus gives us the ability to provide the better customer experience, safety, cleanliness, the expectations of the customers and citizens of Columbia.
So we took those revenue projections just to basically establish what future bond coverage might look like, and that's what this chart intends to convey. And you'll see with that 2024 budgeted year compared to the 2024 projected with rate change, that there's dramatic change in the profitability of the system and in the bond coverage and debt service coverage. So we're generating a bunch of money through these rate changes. It's important to note that there's already a place for all this money, right? They have capital improvement projects, facility upgrades and improvement, the conversion to gateless parking solutions at the parking garages, cloud-based LPR enforcement, automated online citation appeal processes. All these things that they described would be paid for through these rate improvements. Are there any questions? Just wanted to, we pulled together a couple articles here just of recent rate increases that have occurred in your close proximity. Charleston recently increased its hourly fees. Columbia Airport recently increased its fees. Asheville recently increased its fees. Raleigh. And this is just the background of those revenue growth projections that we had made in case there were any questions. And it's important to note that those revenue projections will fluctuate based on the timing of the implementation of any rate changes. If-
And would you be recommending that all of the rate changes happen together? Like, or what have you seen be the most effective?
It's better to rip the Band-Aid off.
Agreed.
It's better to rip the Band-Aid off. If you're going to make the rate changes,
Make all the
the
changes.
slow drip will be burdensome.
I'm sorry, I do have a question, and forgive my tardiness. I'm looking at the chart that has estimates of change in revenues. None of these numbers reflect the rate increases, is that correct?
On which, are you?
Estimates
Of change in revenue? So if you look at the projected 23, 24, wherever it switches to projected is where we increased, where we're showing revenue increases as a result of the rate changes.
So less than 2 million? Am I reading that right? Am I reading that right?
Well, in 23, 24, we're not starting until January, so that probably has something to do with the number. I don't know if Jeff and Missy want to add to that part of the discussion, but we're going to have to, I was going to ask him to actually come up and talk about the timeline we've talked about anyway regarding the bond issuance and.
We have been relatively conservative in these estimations.
Yeah. But I think we want to give ourselves, Councilwoman, the opportunity to give it a few months to see how things are going if we implement in January, and then kind of turn Kelvin and those loose. I mean, they're already teed up for projects to begin, but I would hope by the spring, if the council does move forward with approving the rate increases, we do the educational campaign between now and January, that we give ourselves maybe to, implement the rates in January and give ourselves to a March timeframe to demonstrate how that's going, and then begin some of the infrastructure improvements that we're ready to start with right now, actually. But-
Ms. Wilson, can we engage staff to come back with some technology recommendations, as Councilman Brown and the mayor discussed, about green lights as there's openings in our decks?
Sure.
And just that ease of access if we're going to start.
Are y'all familiar enough already with how to, yes.
Thank you.
And just to qualify that response on the timing and whether it's better to do it all at once. Most times in parking, you can't, because one or more of the technologies prevents it, right? So if you have current single-space on-street meters, to go around and have a staff member reprogram every single one of those single-space meters is an excessively time-consuming process, right? And if you're going to be implementing Lukes, then what we would tell you is, when you introduce the Lukes or the multi-space pay-by-plate meters, that's the time to make that rate change, because you wouldn't want to invest all that time in sending somebody around to tediously change those analog meters.
The only thing I want them doing with those meters is cutting them down.
Yes, sir. If there are no further questions, that concludes my presentation.
So we'll have to do a public hearing and, bring the ordinances forward, and we just need council's, I guess, green light to go ahead and begin to get that done in the next couple of council meetings, and continue the educational campaign we've discussed with the public.
Right, well, just, in my view, I'm taking this as information only. I'm not signing off on anything that was presented today, because there's a couple line items I do want to discuss, with staff and colleagues as well. Thank you.
Are you thinking by September, October timeframe to bring the item back? Any thoughts on that?
Giving us this next month would be enough time for us to talk through some. maybe
Hopeful for
September.
September, to give us time to
I would
do
say
some
October,
education.
November, yeah. Because I mean, I think we need to really think about the thoughtfulness of how we roll. If we're going to go a dynamic pricing, the rollout, but also with the changing of attitudes and education, those need to go hand in hand. So I don't see that, in my opinion, happening in the next 30 days. But the information presented today helps, I guess, craft that ultimate strategy, which I think is a work in progress.
But we're-
If we're ready to implement in January, though, I would suggest you give yourselves longer than a month or two during the holiday season to educate the public.
I think we got to be out by 1st of October. But there's some cleanup in here based on
Right.
today's conversation, so cleaning it up, fixing
So
some
why is,
details.
Ms. Wilson, why is January 1? Why is that the goal?
Well, originally, the goal was to
July
be
1.
done with the fiscal year. So we didn't include, as you all recall, at my recommendation, that we include the public hearing as part of the overall public hearing with the budget, because I did felt like this discussion was more necessary, also getting our staff geared up to help with education of the public and outreach on the different changes. So I wanted to give us between now and January to do that, and then have the rates ready for implementation in January, because we also are in a place that without those increases, that those very necessary CIP projects that Stacy went over, I mean, they're contingent upon the rate increases. So we want to be able to get started with those infrastructure improvements as soon as possible in the new calendar year. But I'm anticipating probably not till March timeframe is what I was saying, because we would give ourselves from January to March to kind of see how the implementation's going.
And the capital improvement budget hinges on what they recommend
Absolutely.
for across the board, for
The
all
rate
of the.
increases that
for-
we, yeah.
okay.
I think there are probably $2 million worth of projects that we're ready to roll on. Am I fair in saying that? I'm looking at the staff. Yeah.
2.2.
2.2 in total, or just that are ready to be done now?
Ready to be done now. So the-
He's got 1.2 that he wants to get done currently, but if you look at our budget, I mean, it's really 2.5.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll totally understand the need to still study things. I think we've made copious notes today on some of the tweaks and things we can bring back. I was just more asking, and I would recommend that we not get too far into the fall before we would start educating the public on what it is we would want to implement in January. But if you say you don't want to implement in January, then I guess that becomes the discussion. We just need to know, I think at this point, when you want us to bring it back to council by way of an ordinance to move forward with approving the rates.
I would like to have it as soon as possible. I mean, I think we've been circling the wagons on this for a while. I mean, there is no perfect parking model. I think this is getting pretty close. I think there's been good discussion and
The
input
public
today.
hearing's got to be in a time period when people are in town.
Yeah, I think September is probably a good time Labor Day is a good time to kick that off.
We could kick it off in November, in September, but October reasonably would be the better day, I think.
we will come back and have further discussion with you before we would put it on the agenda, obviously, and make sure all your questions are answered. Mr. Mayor, good?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we wanted to take up a few items in executive session as well, Mr. Mayor, before the 4 o'clock council meeting.
Mr. Mayor, I move that we move to executive session and receipt of legal advice related to matters covered by attorney-client privilege pursuant to SC Code 30-4-70A2, parking rate study. Receipt of legal advice relating to a pending, threatened, or potential claim pursuant to SC Code 30-4-70A2, Kevin Bovin versus the City of Columbia. Discussion of negotiations incident to proposed contractual arrangements pursuant to SC Code 30-4-70A2, fire services, and would like to add to the discussion of an employment of an employee pursuant to SC Code 30-4-70A1, municipal court judges.
Got a motion and a second. Any comments, questions? Hearing none, seeing none. Madam Clerk, please read the roll.
Mr. Bailey?
Aye.
Mr. Brown?
Aye.
Ms. Herbert?
Aye.
Dr. Bustles?
Aye.
Mr. Brennan?
Yes.
Mr. McDowell? Mayor Rickaman?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you.